Sometimes the people we fear most are the ones protecting us from what we cannot see. Sometimes the neighbor we avoid holds secrets that could save our lives. In a remote Norse village, 70-year-old Astrid walks 4 massive wolves through the snowy streets every morning. The villagers watch from their windows, whispering about the strange woman who lives alone. When a child goes missing during the harshest winter anyone can remember, everyone blames Astrid and her wolves. But they're wrong. Astrid isn't just an old woman with dangerous pets. She's been guarding an ancient secret for decades, protecting the village from threats they never knew existed. She made an oath to the gods long ago, and now that oath might be the only thing standing between her people and something far worse than wolves. What happens when the protector becomes the accused? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first light of dawn painted the snow-covered rooftops of Ravenshallow in shades of rose and gold. Between the towering pines that guarded the village like ancient sentinels, mist rose from the nearby fjord, carrying with it the salt tang of the sea and the crisp promise of another harsh winter day. This was the kind of morning that reminded a person of their place in the world, small, fragile, dependent on the mercy of forces far greater than themselves. Astrid Eriksdottir emerged from her cottage at the forest's edge, as she had every morning for the past 23 years. Her weathered hands gripped a gnarled oak staff, its surface carved with protective runes that most villagers assumed were merely decorative. The wood had been passed down through 3 generations of women in her family, each adding their own marks to its surface. To those who knew how to look, the staff told the story of oath keepers, of women who had stood between the darkness and the light. 4 massive wolves padded silently from the shadows behind her cottage. Each stood nearly as tall as a pony at the shoulder, their coats thick with winter fur that gleamed silver-white in the morning light. The largest, a magnificent beast with eyes like amber fire, wore a weathered leather collar inscribed with runes that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light. These were not ordinary wolves, though the villagers had long since stopped asking questions about their unnatural size and intelligence. Astrid's own appearance spoke of a life lived fully, each line on her face a story, each streak of silver in her braided hair a year of wisdom earned. At 73, she moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to respect her body's limitations while never forgetting its capabilities. Her blue eyes, still sharp as winter ice, missed nothing as she surveyed the village that had been her charge for more than 2 decades. The daily procession began, as it always did, with measured steps down the narrow path that connected her isolated cottage to the village proper. The wolves flanked her in a formation that spoke of old military discipline: 2 ahead, 2 behind, always alert, always watching. Their breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as they moved with purpose through the snow-laden streets of Ravenshallow. The village itself nestled in a natural hollow between steep hills, protected from the worst of the northern winds, but never entirely safe from the wilderness that pressed close on all sides. Wooden houses with steep-pitched roofs lined streets that had been worn smooth by generations of feet, hooves, and wagon wheels. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin grey ribbons, carrying the scent of burning pine and the promise of warm hearths within. From those houses, faces appeared at frost-rimmed windows. The watchers were always the same: Bjorn Ironson, the village elder, standing at his front door with arms crossed and expression unreadable; Sigrid the weaver, pressing her nose to the glass with her young daughter Freya beside her; old Magnus the smith, who always nodded respectfully but never approached; Eric, barely 14 winters old, whose curious eyes held none of the fear that marked his elders. The whispers followed Astrid's procession like a familiar melody played in a minor key. "There goes the wolf woman," they would say. "Strange that she never ages like the rest of us. Remember when she first arrived, that terrible winter when the ice bears came down from the mountains? My grandmother said she was there during the Battle of Thornfield, but that was 50 years ago. Shield Maiden, they say, or perhaps something more. The truth, as truth often did, lived somewhere between the whispers and the silence. Astrid had indeed been a shield maiden in her youth, though the battles she had fought were not the kind that appeared in the sagas. She had stood on fields where the dead did not stay dead, where ancient things that should have remained buried clawed their way back to the surface. She had made an oath in blood and starlight to powers that most people preferred to believe were merely stories told to frighten children. Her cottage reflected this hidden nature in ways that the casual observer might miss. Built against the hillside where the forest began its earnest climb toward the mountains, it seemed to grow from the earth itself. The walls were thick stone and timber, designed to withstand more than mere weather. Gardens that should not have thrived in the harsh northern climate somehow produced herbs and vegetables year-round, protected by something more substantial than greenhouse glass. Wind chimes made from carved bone and antler hung from the eaves, their soft music audible only to those who knew how to listen. Inside, the cottage told the story of a life lived between worlds. Shelves lined the walls, holding jars of preserved foods, alongside vials of things that had no names in the common tongue. Books bound in leather, cracked with age, shared space with scrolls, written in scripts that predated the village by centuries. Weapons hung on the walls, not decorative pieces, but tools that had seen use, their edges still sharp, despite their obvious age. But it was the people of Ravenshollow who truly defined Astrid's world, for all that they kept their distance. Bjorn Ironson had been village elder for nearly 15 years, a position he had inherited from his father, along with a healthy respect for things he did not fully understand. He was a good man, thoughtful and fair, but he carried the weight of responsibility for 200 souls who looked to him for guidance in an uncertain world. His iron-grey beard and weathered features spoke of a life spent making difficult decisions, and his eyes held the wariness of someone who had learned that not all threats announced themselves with horns and battle cries. Sigrid Olafsdottir commanded respect in her own right as the village's master weaver, but her reputation rested on more than skill with loom and spindle. Widowed young when her husband fell through the ice while fishing, she had raised her daughter Freya alone while building a trade network that brought prosperity to Ravenshollow. Her auburn hair showed no grey despite her 40-odd years, and her green eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who understood the value of both tradition and adaptation. She watched Astrid with the complex mixture of gratitude and suspicion that marked those who sensed there was more to their protector than met the eye. Young Eric Ragnarsson represented the village's future in ways that even he did not yet understand. The blacksmith's apprentice possessed the restless curiosity of youth, combined with an unusual sensitivity to the currents that flowed beneath the surface of ordinary life. His sandy hair and earnest brown eyes marked him, as perhaps the only villager who looked at Astrid's wolves without fear, seeing in them something that called to a part of his soul he had not yet learned to name. The other villagers, Magnus the smith, with his scorched leather apron and knowing glances, Helga the healer, who sometimes consulted with Astrid about herbs that could not be found in any conventional garden, Thorvin the hunter, who had once seen Astrid move through the forest with impossible grace and speed, all contributed to the complex tapestry of a community that had learned to accept mysteries as part of the price of survival. As Astrid completed her morning circuit through the village, the wolves' behavior provided its own subtle narrative. They moved with the disciplined awareness of warriors on patrol, their senses attuned to threats that human perception could not detect. The way they positioned themselves at street corners, the manner in which their ears would swivel toward the forest at sounds too faint for human hearing, the occasional low growl that would rumble in the throat of the pack leader when something in the wind carried a scent that spoke of danger. All of this told the story of guardians maintaining their eternal vigil. The collar worn by the alpha wolf, ancient leather marked with runes that seemed to shift and change when viewed from the corner of the eye, served as both symbol and tool of the bond that connected Astrid to her companions. Those markings were not mere decoration, but a form of writing that predated the arrival of the Norse gods, a script that spoke of obligations and loyalties that transcended the boundary between life and death. The village itself bore subtle signs of supernatural protection for those who knew how to recognize them. The way the wind patterns shifted around the houses during the worst storms, the fact that wildlife, both predator and prey, maintained a respectful distance from the settlement, the manner in which the northern lights seemed to dance with particular intensity over Ravenshollow during the longest nights of winter. These were not coincidences, but evidence of wards maintained by someone who understood the old ways. As the procession returned to the cottage at the forest's edge, Astrid paused to look back at the village that had become her responsibility. The smoke rising from chimneys, the sounds of daily life beginning as the sun climbed higher, the laughter of children brave enough to play in the snow, despite their parents' warnings about staying close to home. All of this represented what she had sworn to protect. Not just the people themselves, but the simple human right to live without fear of things that stalked in the darkness beyond the firelight. The wolves settled into their customary positions around the cottage, some visible, others melting into the shadows of the forest in a defensive perimeter that had never failed in more than 2 decades. Their presence allowed Astrid to maintain the illusion of normalcy, to play the role of eccentric old woman with unusual pets, while never forgetting that she was the last line of defense against forces that would reduce Ravenshollow to nothing more than scattered bones and ash-covered ruins. The staff she carried told its own story to those who could read the marks carved into its surface. Each rune represented a battle fought, a ward maintained, a life saved. The wood itself had been taken from Yggdrasil's roots, in the time before time, when the world was young and the gods still walked among mortals. It had been passed down through generations of women who had accepted the burden of standing between the light and the darkness, each adding her own chapter to the story, written in carved symbols and bitter experience. As Astrid settled into the rhythm of another day, preparing the herbs that would protect the village's livestock from diseases both natural and supernatural, maintaining the wards that kept the truly dangerous predators at bay, she allowed herself a moment to remember the young shield maiden she had once been. That woman had believed that heroism was about glory and songs, about standing in the shield wall and meeting death with a sword in her hand and a prayer to Odin on her lips. The woman she had become understood that true heroism often looked like nothing more than an old woman taking a walk with her dogs, that the most important battles were fought not on blood-soaked fields, but in the quiet moments when darkness pressed close and only vigilance stood between chaos and peace. It was a lesson that had taken decades to learn, written in the lines on her face and the weight of years that settled on her shoulders like a familiar cloak. The morning's circuit complete, Astrid began the daily tasks that maintained her guardianship. The herbs needed harvesting, the wards required renewal. The ancient knowledge had to be preserved against the possibility that someday another would need to take up the burden she carried. It was work that would never be complete, responsibility that would end only when she drew her last breath. But as she looked out at the village, settling into its daily routine, protected and unaware of the forces that sought its destruction, she knew that every morning walk, every sleepless night of vigilance, every year of isolation had been worth the price. The wolves understood, as they always had. They were more than companions, more than guardians. They were the bridge between the world as it appeared and the world as it truly was, between the simple life of a Norse village and the eternal struggle that determined whether such places would continue to exist. Their amber eyes held memories of battles fought in times when gods walked the earth, and their loyalty was to something greater than any single person or place. As the sun climbed higher and the village came fully awake, Astrid allowed herself a small smile. Another day had begun, another a chance to stand watch over the people who called Ravenshollow home. The challenges would come, they always did, but for now, in this moment, all was well. The staff felt solid in her hands, the wolves were alert and ready, and the ancient oath that bound her to this purpose burned steady as a forge fire in her heart. Whatever darkness might emerge from the forest's depths, whatever threat might descend from the mountains or rise from the fjord, it would find Ravenshollow protected, not by walls or weapons, though those had their place, but by the unbreakable will of an old woman who had long ago decided that some things were worth any sacrifice necessary to preserve them. The daily vigil continued, as it had for 23 years, as it would until her strength finally failed or another took up the burden. This was the way of guardianship, the price of protection, the weight of oaths made to powers that remembered when the world was young and full of wonders that modern people could barely imagine. But that was a story for another day, a tale written in runes and starlight, and the patient wisdom of those who understood that the greatest battles were often fought, not with sword and shield, but with steadfast determination and the simple refusal to surrender what mattered most. The blizzard came without warning on the third day of the new moon, arriving with the sudden violence that marked the deepest part of winter in the northern lands. What had begun as a gentle snowfall during the morning meal transformed by midday into a howling wall of white that reduced visibility to mere arm's length and turned familiar streets into treacherous mazes of ice and confusion. Young Freya Sigridsdottir had been playing near the well with two other children when the wind began to keen like a wounded animal. The other children, Nils and little Gunnar, had heeded their mother's calls to come inside immediately. But Freya possessed the stubborn curiosity that often marked those destined for greater things. She lingered, fascinated by the way the snowflakes seemed to dance with purpose rather than merely falling, drawn by whispers in the wind that spoke in a language older than words. By the time Sigrid realized her daughter had not returned home, the storm had reached full fury. The weaver's calls were swallowed by the shrieking wind before they could travel beyond her own doorway. Panic, cold and sharp as winter iron, took hold of her heart as she wrapped herself in her thickest cloak and ventured into the white chaos that had consumed Ravenshollow. The search began immediately, despite the impossible conditions. Bjorn organized the effort with the methodical thoroughness that had served him well as village elder, sending searchers in pairs to prevent anyone else from becoming lost in the storm. Magnus left his forge cold for the first time in memory, while Thorvin abandoned his traplines to join the desperate hunt. Even old Helga, bent with arthritis and wisdom, insisted on helping despite the danger the weather posed to her aged bones. But the blizzard seemed to possess a malevolent intelligence, thwarting their efforts at every turn. Tracks filled with snow before they could be followed. Voices were torn away by the wind before they could be heard, and the familiar landmarks that should have guided them home became invisible phantoms in the swirling white darkness. Hours passed with no sign of the missing girl, and with each moment that stretched into the next, hope grew thinner than spider's silk. It was young Eric who found the first clue, his sharp eyes spotting a splash of blue against the white near the forest's edge. Freya's cloak, the one her mother had woven with particular care from wool dyed the deep blue of summer skies, lay torn and twisted among the roots of an ancient pine. The fabric had been shredded as if by claws, but the damage told a story that made no sense to those who examined it with ordinary gruz and understanding. The tears in the wool formed patterns too deliberate to be accidental, too symbolic to be the work of any natural predator. Where the cloak had been rent, dark stains marked the fabric, not blood, as the searchers initially feared, but something that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, something that seemed to shift and move when viewed directly. The scent that rose from the cloth was wrong in ways that human language had no words to describe, carrying hints of ancient hunger and patient malevolence. But it was the tracks near the cloak that truly unsettled those who saw them. Pressed deep into the snow were prints larger than any wolf's, shaped like paws but wrong in their proportions. The marks stretched too long, the claw impressions cut too deep, and the spacing between steps suggested a gait that belonged to no creature that should walk the earth. Most disturbing of all, the tracks led not deeper into the forest as expected, but seemed to circle the village itself before disappearing at the stone foundations of the oldest houses. Astrid arrived at the scene, while the others still stood in stunned silence, her wolves flanking her like grey shadows given substance. She moved through the storm with impossible ease, her weathered cloak untouched by the wind that should have torn it from her shoulders. The searchers stepped aside without conscious thought, some primitive instinct, recognizing authority that transcended village hierarchies or social conventions. She knelt beside the torn cloak with reverent care, her fingers tracing the patterns in the damaged fabric, while her wolves formed a protective circle around the group. The amber-eyed alpha lowered his massive head to sniff the strange stains, then pulled back with a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the bones of everyone present. The sound carried warnings in harmonics that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the part of the human soul that remembered when. Darkness held genuine terror. "This is not the work of any natural beast," Astrid said finally, her voice carrying clearly despite the storm's fury. Her words fell into the sudden silence like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of understanding that spread through the gathered villagers. "The child lives, but she has been taken by something that should not walk in this world." The accusation came from Thorvin first, though others quickly joined their voices to his. Here was their familiar scapegoat, the strange woman with her unnatural companions, standing over evidence of their worst fears, made manifest. The logic seemed inescapable to minds clouded by panic and superstition. Who else but the wolf woman could command beasts to steal children? Who else but the outsider who had never truly belonged could be responsible for bringing darkness to their peaceful village? "Where is she?" Sigrid's voice cracked like breaking ice as she confronted Astrid with the desperate fury of a mother whose world had collapsed. "What have you done with my daughter? What unholy compact have you made with the creatures of the forest?" Astrid rose slowly, her blue eyes reflecting depths of sorrow that spoke of losses beyond counting. She looked at each face in turn, Bjorn's conflicted expression as duty warred with instinct. Magnus's uncomfortable shifting as he avoided her gaze, Thorvin's open hostility, Eric's confused loyalty. These were the people she had protected for more than 2 decades, the community she had sworn to guard with her life, and they stood ready to condemn her based on fear and misunderstanding. "I have protected this village since before some of you were born," she said quietly, her words carrying the weight of absolute truth. "I have stood watch through nights when horrors pressed close enough to fog your windows with their breath. I have turned aside threats that would have left nothing but bones and ashes where your homes now stand. And still you would make me your enemy based on ignorance and terror." The wind seemed to listen to her words, growing quieter as if even the storm recognized the gravity of the moment. In that relative stillness, other sounds became audible, the distant howling of things that were not quite wolves, the creaking of tree branches bent by more than natural forces, the whispered voices that spoke in languages that predated human speech. "Help us find her," Eric said suddenly, his young voice cutting through the tension with the clarity of honest desperation. "If you know what took Freya, if you understand the tracks and the signs, then help us bring her home. Prove them wrong." Astrid's expression softened as she looked at the boy, who alone among them chose trust over suspicion. "I would gladly give my life to restore that child to her mother's arms," she replied. "But you must understand, the thing that has taken her is not some common predator that can be driven off with torches and spears. It is ancient beyond your comprehension, hungry in ways that have nothing to do with mere flesh and it has been waiting for this moment since before your grandfather's grandfathers drew breath." The implications of her words settled over the group like a shroud. If Astrid spoke truly, then Freya faced a fate worse than death, trapped by something that existed outside the natural order. But accepting the truth meant also accepting that their familiar world was far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. That the stories whispered around winter fires might be more than mere tales to frighten children. "Then why didn't you warn us?" Bjorn asked, his authority wavering in the face of revelations that challenged everything he thought he understood about his responsibilities as leader. "If such threats exist, why keep us ignorant? Why let us believe we were safe?" Astrid's smile held no warmth, only the bitter wisdom of someone who had learned the price of knowledge, the hard way. "Because ignorance was your shield," she answered. "Because belief in safety allowed you to live as humans should live, with hope, with joy, with the simple faith that tomorrow would dawn much like today. I chose to carry the burden of awareness so that you would not have to." The storm began to intensify again, as if their conversation had disturbed some delicate balance. The wolves grew restless, their ears swiveling toward sounds that human hearing could not detect. The alpha's growl deepened, and the other pack members took positions that spoke of imminent threat approaching through the white chaos of the blizzard. "It comes," Astrid said simply, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had faced such moments before. "The hunger stirs, drawn by the child's blood and the fear that feeds it. Tonight will test everything I have built here, every ward I have laid, every protection I have woven around this place." The searchers looked at each other with dawning, understanding that they stood on the threshold of something far beyond their experience. The comfortable world of daily concerns and ordinary worries had been swept away as completely as footprints in fresh snow, replaced by a reality where ancient hungers could reach across centuries to claim the innocent. As they made their way back to the village through the howling storm, carrying Freya's torn cloak like a battle standard of loss and desperation, each person carried their own burden of newfound knowledge. The woman they had feared and whispered about was either their salvation or their doom, and the choice between trust and suspicion would determine not just one child's fate, but the survival of everything they held dear. Behind them, the tracks in the snow began to glow with a faint phosphorescence that hurt the eyes to look upon directly. The ancient thing that had made them was awakening fully for the first time in generations, called from its patient slumber by the scent of divine blood and the promise of feasts that had been denied too long. The game had begun, and Astrid knew that everything she had worked to build, every relationship, every carefully maintained balance, every year of quiet guardianship, now hung in the balance. The villagers would have to choose, and choose quickly, between the comfortable lies that had protected them and the terrible truths that might save them. In the distance, something that was not quite a wolf and certainly not entirely natural began to howl, its voice joined by others until the very air trembled with the sound of hunger given voice. The storm was no longer just weather, but a manifestation of will, and at its heart waited something that had been patient far too long. Freya was alive for now, but time, like the snow that continued to fall, was running out for them all. The village hall had not seen such a gathering since the year of the failed harvest, when desperate decisions had been required to survive the coming winter. Now, as the blizzard continued to rage outside, the entire population of Ravenshollow crowded into the timber-framed building, their faces lit by the flickering glow of oil lamps and the great hearth that dominated the far wall. The air hung thick with tension, fear, and the acrid scent of too many unwashed bodies pressed close together in desperate counsel. Bjorn Ironson stood before the assembly, his weathered hands gripping the carved staff that marked his authority as village elder. The weight of leadership had never felt heavier than it did in this moment, with a child missing and his people looking to him for answers he did not possess. His iron-grey beard trembled slightly as he surveyed the crowd, seeing in their faces the reflection of his own uncertainty and growing desperation. "We are here because one of our own has been taken," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, despite the wind that rattled the shutters. Young Freya Sigridsdottir vanished in the storm, leaving behind only traces that make no sense to any of us. We must decide how to respond, how to find her, and how to protect ourselves from whatever force has entered our lands. The murmur that followed his words carried undertones of accusation and suspicion. Eyes turned repeatedly toward the empty space near the door, where Astrid would normally stand during village gatherings, her absence as conspicuous as a missing tooth in a familiar smile. The fact that she had not come to defend herself only seemed to confirm the growing certainty that she was somehow responsible for the tragedy that had befallen them. Sigrid rose from her place near the front, her face pale but her voice steady with the controlled fury of a mother whose world had been torn apart. "We all saw the tracks," she said, her words falling into the sudden silence like hammer blows on anvil. "Tracks too large to be natural, leading from where my daughter's cloak was found. And who among us walks with wolves? Who among us has made herself apart from our community, keeping secrets and consorting with beasts?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire, acrid and choking. Magnus the smith shifted uncomfortably in his seat, remembering the countless times Astrid had quietly prevented disasters, livestock diseases that never quite took hold, predators that inexplicably avoided their hunting grounds, storms that seemed to part around the village like water around a stone. But the memory of such protections felt insubstantial when weighed against a mother's grief and the very real evidence of supernatural threat. "She came to the scene too quickly," Thorvin added, his hunter's instincts feeding the growing suspicion. "How did she move through the storm so easily when the rest of us could barely see our own hands? How did her wolves know exactly where to go, as if they had been there before?" Young Eric Ragnarsson stood suddenly, his face flushed, with the righteous anger of youth confronting what he saw as monstrous injustice. "Astrid has protected this village for longer than I've been alive," he declared, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. "My grandfather told me stories, how she arrived during the winter of the ice bears, how she stood guard when the shadow sickness tried to take root in our fields. You're condemning the one person who might actually be able to help us." "Stories," Thorvin scoffed, though his dismissal carried less conviction than his words suggested. "Old tales told by old men who saw mystery where there was only luck and coincidence. What we have now is real evidence, a missing child, and tracks that lead toward the home of a woman who keeps wolves as others keep sheep." The debate that followed revealed the deep fractures that had always existed beneath Ravenshallow's surface unity. There were those who remembered the strange incidents that had surrounded Astrid's arrival, the unnatural ways. Threats had been turned aside during her years among them. But there were others who had always resented her presence, who saw in her isolation and obvious secrets a challenge to their understanding of the world and their place within it. As the arguments grew more heated, none of them noticed the subtle changes occurring beyond the hall's walls. The wind, which had been howling with mindless fury, began to carry new sounds, whispers in languages that predated human speech, the distant howling of things that wore the shape of wolves but served darker purposes. The temperature dropped beyond what even the harsh northern winter could explain, and frost began to form on the inside of windows, despite the roaring fires that burned in every hearth. In her cottage at the forest's edge, Astrid sat before her own fire, her weathered hands moving with practiced precision as she carved new runes into the surface of her ancient staff. Each symbol, she added, pulsed briefly with inner light, before settling into the wood as if it had always been there. The battle horn that hung above her mantelpiece, cracked and silent for decades, seemed to gleam in the firelight with anticipation of being called to service once more. The 4 wolves lay arranged around her in a defensive pattern, their amber eyes reflecting not just the flames, but something deeper, memories of battlefields where the fate of worlds had been decided, but of oaths sworn in blood and starlight that bound them to purposes greater than mere survival. The largest, The pack leader, whose collar bore the most ancient runes, raised his massive head to look directly at his mistress with an intelligence that spoke of understanding beyond animal instinct. "They fear what they do not understand," Astrid murmured to her companions, her voice carrying the weight of countless similar moments across the centuries. "It has always been thus with mortals. They would rather blame the guardian than acknowledge the existence of what she guards against." A new symbol appeared beneath her knife, one that had not been carved for 3 generations. It represented sacrifice, the willing surrender of one life to preserve many others. The wolf with the runic collar whined softly, recognizing the implications of what his mistress was preparing. The sound carried notes of mourning for losses that had not yet occurred, but were becoming inevitable. Back in the village hall, the debate had taken on the character of a trial, with Astrid condemned in absentia based on fear and circumstantial evidence. Bjorn found himself struggling to maintain order as voices rose and accusations multiplied. The careful balance of authority and consensus that normally governed village decisions was crumbling under the pressure of crisis and terror. "We should confront her directly," Sigrid declared, her maternal grief transforming into something harder and more dangerous. "Demand that she explain her movements during the storm, that she account for her wolves' behavior. If she truly has nothing to hide, let her prove it before us all." The suggestion carried the weight of desperate hope wrapped in the language of justice. Here was action they could take, a way to channel their fear and helplessness into something that felt like progress. The murmur of agreement that followed showed how quickly reasonable people could be transformed by crisis into something resembling a mob. "And if she refuses to come?" Magnus asked quietly, his deep voice cutting through the rising excitement like cold water on forge fire. "If she will not submit to our questions or accept our judgment, what then?" The silence that followed his words carried its own answer. In the space of a few hours, the woman who had been their protector had become their primary suspect, and the community that had lived in peace for generations was preparing to turn against the one person who might be able to save them. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but now it carried passengers' shapes that moved through the wind like shadows given substance, hunting for weaknesses in the ancient wards that had kept Ravenshollow safe for so long. The hunger was stirring, drawn by the scent of fear and discord, and it would not be patient much longer. Time was running out for them all, and the choices made in the next few hours would determine whether Ravenshollow survived to see another spring, or joined the countless other settlements that had simply vanished into legend, leaving behind only empty foundations and questions that no one remained alive to answer. The second night brought sounds that no earthly throat should have been able to produce. Long, mournful howls echoed across the village, but these were not the familiar calls of ordinary wolves hunting in the deep forest. These voices carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in human bones, creating an unease that went beyond rational fear, and spoke directly to the most primitive parts of the mind, where ancient terrors still held dominion. Sigrid lay awake in her bed, clutching the silver pendant that had belonged to her grandmother, a Thor's hammer, worn smooth by generations of faithful hands. The piece had been passed down through the women of her family for 5 generations, each adding their own prayers and hopes to the metal until it seemed to pulse with accumulated faith. Now she pressed it against her heart and whispered the old prayers, seeking comfort in traditions that suddenly felt fragile as spider silk against the darkness pressing close outside her windows. The livestock felt it first, as animals always did. Cattle lowed with distress throughout the night, pressing themselves against the far walls of their shelters, as if trying to escape something that stalked beyond human perception. Horses whinnied with terror and kicked at their stall doors, their eyes rolling white with panic. Even the village dogs, normally bold enough to challenge any threat, cowered, silent and trembling beneath their owners' tables. But it was the sheep that paid the price for the night's visitation. Magnus discovered them at first light, or what remained of them scattered across the snow behind Thorvin's house. The carnage defied explanation. These were not the clean kills of natural predators seeking sustenance, but something far more disturbing. The animals had been torn apart with surgical precision, their blood drained completely, while their flesh remained untouched, as if something had fed not on their meat, but on their life force itself. The tracks surrounding the slaughter site told a story that made even Thorfinn's experienced hunter's eye struggle to comprehend what he was seeing. Paw prints the size of a man's head pressed deep into the frozen earth, but the gait was wrong, too long between steps, too deliberate in their placement. Most unsettling of all, the tracks seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles, as if the very ground rejected the memory of what had passed over it. Word of the attack spread through the village like fire through dry thatch. By the time the sun had fully risen, a crowd had gathered around the scene of destruction, their faces pale with the recognition that their worst fears were being confirmed. This was no ordinary predator drawn by the scent of easy prey. This was something that killed for pleasure, something that understood the value of terror as a weapon. "Look at the patterns," Helga whispered, her aged voice carrying clearly in the shocked silence. The old healer's eyes, dimmed by years but sharpened by wisdom, traced the arrangement of the carcasses with growing alarm. "They're not scattered at random. Something arranged them this way deliberately." The truth of her observation became clear as the villagers studied the scene more carefully. The dead sheep formed a rough circle, their heads all pointing toward the center, where symbols had been carved into the frozen earth. The markings were unlike anything in their experience, not the familiar runes of their ancestors, but something older and far more sinister. The very sight of them made eyes water and minds rebel, as if human perception was not meant to process their meaning. Young Eric approached the edge of the circle cautiously, his curiosity warring with the instinctive revulsion that the symbols inspired. "They're trying to tell us something," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the wind. "This isn't just hunting, it's a message." Sigrid's control finally shattered at the sight of the deliberate cruelty displayed before them. Her grief transformed into fury, and she wheeled to face the crowd with eyes that blazed like forge fire. "How many more must die before we act?" she demanded, her voice carrying across the gathering like a battle cry. "How many more nights will we cower in our homes, while this creature and whoever commands it picks us off one by one?" The silver pendant at her throat caught the weak sunlight as she spoke, its familiar weight providing an anchor point for faith that felt increasingly inadequate against the forces arrayed against them. Her grandmother had worn this same piece through the terrible winter when plague had threatened to claim half the village, and her great-grandmother had carried it through the year of the blood aurora when the northern lights had burned red for 3 straight months. But those had been natural disasters, comprehensible within the framework of their understanding. This was something else entirely. "The wolf woman must answer for this," Thorfinn declared, his usual hunter's pragmatism overwhelmed by the scope of destruction before them. Who else in this village consorts with creatures that could do such work? Who else moves through the forest as if she owned it, commanding beasts that should fear human presence? But Eric found himself studying the tricks with the fresh eyes of youth, unencumbered by preconceptions. Something about their arrangement bothered him, a pattern that nagged at the edge of his consciousness like a half-remembered song. "These aren't Astrid's wolves," he said suddenly, his words cutting through the rising murmur of accusation and agreement. "Look at the spacing, the depth. Her wolves are large, yes, but these prints are from something else entirely." His observation gave pause to those willing to listen, but Sigrid was beyond such rational considerations. The pendant seemed to burn against her skin as she spoke, its silver surface growing warm with the intensity of her emotion. "Then she has summoned others to do her bidding," she replied, her voice carrying the certainty of someone whose world had been reduced to simple equations of guilt and innocence, threat and safety. The morning sun climbed higher, but it brought no warmth to the scene of carnage or comfort to the hearts of those who witnessed it. The symbols carved into the earth seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, creating patches of shadow that defied the natural order. Frost continued to form around their edges, despite the growing brightness of the day, as if winter itself was drawn to their presence. As the crowd began to disperse, each person carrying their own burden of fear and determination, none of them noticed the figure watching from the forest's edge. Astrid stood motionless among the trees, her ancient eyes taking in every detail of the scene, with the grim recognition of someone who had seen such work before. Her wolves flanked her in defensive positions, their amber gazes fixed not on the villagers but on the deeper shadows, where things that should not exist waited with patient hunger. The pendant that Sigrid wore was indeed ancient, its silver blessed by generations of faith and prayer. But Astrid could see what the villagers could not, the way its light flickered when it came too close to the symbols, the manner in which its protective power wavered like a candle flame in a storm wind. The forces they faced were older than Thor, older than the gods whose protection the villagers sought, and they would require more than traditional faith to defeat. The message left in blood and terror was clear to those who knew how to read such things. The hunger was announcing its presence, declaring its intent, and testing the strength of the wards that had protected Ravenshollow for so long. Soon it would tire of games and gestures, and when that moment came, the village would face a choice between trust and destruction. But first, there would be more nights like this one, more tests of resolve and faith, more opportunities for fear to drive wedges between the protector and the protected. The ancient enemy was patient. It had learned the value of allowing mortals to destroy themselves before moving in to claim what remained. Time was growing short, and the luxury of ignorance, and was about to be stripped away forever. Whether Ravenshollow would survive the revelation depended entirely on choices that had not yet been made, alliances that had not yet been forged, and trust that had not yet been earned. The game continued, but the stakes had just been raised beyond anything the villagers could comprehend. The hunting party that assembled at dawn numbered 12 of the village's strongest men, armed with spears, axes, and the grim determination of those who had seen too much death to retreat into comfortable denial. Thorvin led them, his tracker's skills honed by years of reading the forest's secrets, while Magnus carried the great two-handed sword that had belonged to his grandfather, a weapon that had seen battle in the old wars and bore nicks along its edge like medals of honor. They followed the unnatural tracks deeper into the forest than any of them had ventured in years, through stands of pine so ancient that their trunks blocked out the winter sky and created a perpetual twilight beneath their boughs. The trail wound between moss-covered boulders and across frozen streams, leading always upward toward the mountains where local legend claimed the old gods had once walked among mortals. The thing they hunted seemed to take pleasure in leaving, signs of its passage, claw marks gouged deep into tree bark, patches of snow stained with substances that were not quite blood, and always those massive tracks that hurt the eyes to study too closely. But there was method in the creature's movements, a purpose that spoke of intelligence far beyond animal cunning. It was Bjorn who noticed that they were being herded, guided along a specific path toward a destination of the creature's choosing, rather than tracking a fleeing beast. His years as village elder had taught him to recognize manipulation in its many forms, and the patterns of their pursuit felt too convenient, too deliberate. But by the time he voiced his concerns, they had already traveled too far from home to easily retreat. The attack came at the place where 3 streams converged, forming a natural amphitheater, surrounded by standing stones that predated any human settlement in the region. The hunters found themselves facing not one creature but 3 wolves in shape, but wrong in every detail, their eyes burning with intelligence that spoke of malevolent purpose rather than natural hunger. These were not the clean, graceful predators that belonged to the northern forests. They moved with jerky, unnatural motions, as if death had not entirely released its claim on muscles and sinew. Their fur was the color of old bone, and where their paws touched the ground, frost spread outward in crystalline patterns that spoke of supernatural cold. Most terrifying of all, they seemed to anticipate the hunters' movements, coordinating their attack with the precision of soldiers who had fought together across centuries. The battle was brief and brutal. Spears that should have found their marks seemed to pass through the creatures without effect, while axes that bit deep into unnatural flesh drew no blood, but only a substance like liquid shadow that burned the hands of those who touched it. The hunters' weapons, forged by honest smiths for honest work, proved inadequate against enemies that existed partially outside the natural order. When the survivors limped back to Ravenshollow as the sun touched the western peaks, they carried with them more than physical wounds. Magnus had fallen, defending his companions, his grandfather's sword shattered against hide that turned steel like water. Young Gunnar would never walk properly again, his leg twisted by jaws that seemed to drain strength along with blood. But worst of all was the look in their eyes, the hollow stare of men who had seen their understanding of the world torn apart and rebuilt into something far more terrible. "They played with us," Thorvin whispered to the crowd that gathered around the returning hunters. His voice, normally steady with the confidence of experience, now shook like autumn leaves in a storm wind. Like cats with mice, they let us think we were hunting them while they drove us exactly where they wanted us to go. The broken runestone that Eric discovered in Thorvin's pack told its own story to those who could read the ancient script carved into its weathered surface. Half of a tablet that had once stood as a warning, its remaining text spoke of enemies that had walked the earth before the gods established their dominion. Creatures of hunger and shadow that fed not on flesh, but on the life force itself. Astrid emerged from her cottage as the survivors were helped to their homes, her weathered face grave with the recognition of truths she had hoped would remain hidden for another generation. Her wolves flanked her with unusual alertness, their amber eyes scanning the forest edge for signs of pursuit that human senses could not detect. The ancient staff in her hands seemed to pulse with inner light, its carved runes responding to the proximity of powers that challenged the natural order. "You found the old marker stones," she said quietly, her voice carrying to every member of the crowd, despite its gentle tone. "The place where warnings were carved in the early days, when the boundaries between worlds were not so firmly fixed as they are now." The broken tablet Eric clutched told only half the story, but Astrid could read the missing pieces in the patterns of frost that still clung to the hunter's clothing and the way shadows seemed to bend toward them even in the failing daylight. These were the signs of contact with the hunger, the ancient enemy that had slumbered beneath the world's notice for generations, while she maintained the wards that kept it contained. "What are those things?" Bjorn demanded, his authority as village elder suddenly feeling as fragile as spider silk before forces that mocked human understanding. What manner of creatures hunt with such intelligence, such deliberate cruelty? Astrid's blue eyes reflected depths of memory that stretched back across decades of vigilance, years of standing watch against threats that most people preferred to believe were merely stories told to frighten children. "They are what remains when the natural order is corrupted," she answered. "Wolves that died in the service of powers older than the gods, raised to hunt again by masters who understand that fear is the sharpest weapon of all." The crowd pressed closer, hungry for explanations that might make sense of the incomprehensible events that had shattered their peaceful existence. But Astrid's next words brought only deeper unease, for they spoke of enemies that existed beyond the reach of sword and spear, beyond the protection of walls and watchtowers. "They are scouts," she continued, her voice carrying the weight of certainty earned through bitter experience. "Sent ahead to test our defenses, to measure our resolve, to spread the terror that weakens the barriers between what is and what should never be. The true danger has not yet shown itself." In the distance, something howled with a voice that carried notes of triumph and anticipation. The sound echoed from the mountains where the old stones stood, where warnings carved in ancient script spoke of boundaries that should never be crossed and prices that should never be paid. The game was entering its next phase, and the stakes had just been raised beyond anything the villagers had imagined possible. The fragments of the runestone seemed to grow heavier in Eric's hands, as if the partial warnings they contained were becoming more real with each passing moment. Soon, very soon, Ravenshollow would face a choice between the comfortable lies that had protected them and the terrible truths that might save them. But first, there would be more nights of testing, more opportunities for fear to do the enemy's work, more chances for the community to tear itself apart before the real battle even began. The change in the village's attitude toward Astrid was as sudden and complete as a winter storm breaking over clear skies. Where once there had been whispered suspicions and fearful glances, now there was desperate hope, mixed with the kind of terror that comes from recognizing one's complete helplessness in the face of forces beyond comprehension. The survivors of the hunting party had returned with more than wounds. They carried proof that the comfortable world of ordinary dangers had been swept away forever. Eric found himself drawn to Astrid's cottage as iron filings are drawn to lodestone, his curiosity overcoming the warnings of his elders and the very real danger that seemed to press closer with each passing hour. The broken runestone weighed heavy in his hands, its partial warnings gnawing at his thoughts like hunger that could not be satisfied. There were answers to be found, and he suspected that the woman the village had spent years fearing was the only one who possessed them. She was waiting for him in her garden, tending to plants that should not have been able to survive the harsh northern winter, yet somehow flourished in defiance of natural law. Herbs whose names he did not recognize grew in careful rows, their leaves bearing patterns that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. The very air around them felt different, warmer, more alive, touched with possibilities that belonged to older times when the world was wilder and far more dangerous. "You carry questions that burn like forge fire," Astrid said without looking up from her work. Her weathered hands moved among the plants with the careful reverence of someone tending sacred things, gathering leaves and roots according to patterns that spoke of knowledge passed down through generations. "But are you prepared for answers that will change everything you believe about the world and your place within it?" The young man set the broken runestone on the wooden table that stood at the garden's center, its ancient surface seeming to absorb rather than reflect the weak winter light. "The hunters described creatures that should not exist," he said quietly. "Thorvin claims their weapons passed through the beasts like smoke, while others swear the things bled shadows instead of blood. I need to understand what we're facing." Astrid's blue eyes studied him with the intensity of someone weighing souls rather than words. In them, Eric glimpsed depths that spoke of experiences stretching back across decades, of battles fought in darkness against enemies that most people preferred to believe were merely legends. When she finally nodded and gestured for him to sit, he felt as if he had passed some crucial test. "The story begins in the time after Ragnarok," she said, her voice taking on the cadence of ancient tales told around winter fires. "The gods fought their final battle and they fell, as the prophecies foretold. But prophecy speaks only of endings, not of what comes after. In the silence that followed the twilight of the gods, older things began to stir powers that had slumbered beneath divine dominion, waiting for their chance to reclaim the world. From the folds of her cloak, she drew forth an amulet unlike anything Eric had ever seen. Carved from black stone in the shape of a one-eyed raven, it seemed to contain depths that hurt to contemplate directly. The surface bore markings that shifted and flowed like living things, and when Astrid held it up to catch the light, the very air around it seemed to bend and waver. "Odin's eye," she said simply, "given to me by the All-Father himself in the moments before his final battle, when he saw what would rise in the wake of divine twilight. I was chosen not for my strength, though I had that, nor for my wisdom, though I possessed some measure of it. I was chosen because I understood that true victory sometimes requires generations of patient vigilance rather than glorious charges into battle. The amulet pulsed with inner light as she spoke, and Eric felt something stir within his own chest, a recognition that went deeper than conscious thought, as if some part of his soul remembered truths that his mind had never learned. The sensation was both thrilling and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a cliff and feeling the pull of the void below. The creatures that attacked your hunting party are called the Hungry Dead, Astrid continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Wolves that died in service to the ancient powers, raised again to hunt for masters who understand that terror is a weapon more potent than sword or spear. They are scouts and reapers, both sent to test our defenses and gather the fear that their true masters require for sustenance. She rose and moved to a shelf, lined with books, whose leather bindings bore the scars of age and careful use. From among them, she selected a volume bound in scales that seemed to shift color in the lamplight, its pages filled with script that predated the arrival of the Norse gods in these lands. The text spoke of bargains made in desperation, of prices paid in blood and soul stuff, of hungers that could never be satisfied, but only temporarily appeased. Your village, young Eric, sits upon a confluence of ley lines, paths of power that crisscross the earth like veins through flesh. In the old days, before men forgot to fear the darkness, such places were warded with stone and blood, protected by those who understood the true nature of what pressed against the boundaries of the world. I have maintained those wards for 23 years, feeding them with my own life force when necessary, standing watch against the moment when they would finally be tested. The wolves that had accompanied her for so long were not merely unusual pets, she explained, but Einherjar, the chosen slain who had fallen in glorious battle and been granted the honor of serving in death as they had in life. They were her companions in this endless vigil, warriors bound to her cause by oaths that transcended the boundary between life and death. "But I am mortal," she said, her voice carrying the weight of approaching twilight. "My strength wanes with each passing year, and the enemy grows bolder as it senses weakness in the ancient barriers that have contained it. Soon, perhaps very soon, Ravenshollow will face the full fury of the hunger, and when that moment comes, you must be ready to take up the burden I have carried." Eric felt the world shift around him as the implications of her words settled into his consciousness, like stones dropping into still water. The comfortable certainty of his previous existence, apprentice blacksmith in a quiet village, concerned with nothing more complex than the proper tempering of steel and the hope of someday taking a wife, had been swept away as completely as snow before a spring thaw. "Why me?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. The recognition that had stirred when she showed him the amulet, the way his grandfather had always spoken of the old woman with unusual respect, the dreams he had been having lately of standing watch over sleeping villages while strange lights danced in the northern sky. All of it pointed toward a destiny he had never chosen but could no longer avoid. "Because the blood of the ancient kings flows in your veins," Astrid replied, her words carrying the finality of fate itself. "Because you see clearly where others prefer blindness, and because the time has come for the old guardianship to pass to younger hands. The enemy has awakened, and it will not sleep again until either it has fed its ancient hunger or found its eternal rest in the embrace of final defeat." The discovery came at dawn on the 7th day, when the mist that had clung to the forest for nearly a week finally lifted to reveal a figure walking slowly through the snow toward the village gates. At first, the watchers thought their eyes deceived them, for the approaching form seemed too small, too familiar to be real. But as the distance closed and the morning light strengthened, there could be no doubt about what they were seeing. Freya Sigridsdottir walked toward Ravenshollow as if she had merely stepped out for a morning stroll, her blue dress somehow clean and unwrinkled despite a week spent missing in the wilderness. Her golden hair caught the sunlight like spun metal, and her face held the serene expression of someone who had seen wonders beyond mortal comprehension. She moved with purpose, but without haste, as if time itself had become negotiable during her absence. Sigrid's cry of joy could be heard throughout the village as she ran toward her daughter, her weaver's hands shaking with the intensity of relief and desperate love. But even as mother and child embraced, those who watched carefully noticed details that stirred unease beneath the celebration. Freya's skin seemed to glow with inner light. Her eyes held depths that belonged to someone far older than her 7 years. And where her feet touched the snow, patterns appeared, symbols that hurt to look at directly, yet compelled attention with their alien beauty. "She's changed," Helga whispered to those gathered around the reunion, her healer's instincts picking up subtleties that others missed. "Look at her breathing, the way she holds herself. That child has been touched by forces beyond our understanding." The examination that followed revealed the truth in ways that transformed joy into something far more complex. Freya bore no signs of harm, no frostbite or hunger or fear that should have marked a week spent as captive to supernatural predators. Instead, she radiated health and vitality that seemed to emanate from her very bones. Her skin held warmth that defied the winter cold, and her voice carried harmonics that made listeners lean closer despite themselves. But it was Eric who made the discovery that changed everything, his sharp eyes catching the detail that all others had missed. As Freya played with the wooden toys her mother had carved during her absence, he noticed the mark that had appeared on the back of her neck, a birthmark in the shape of Yggdrasil, the world tree, that glowed with faint phosphorescence when shadows fell across it. "She bears the sign," Astrid said quietly when Eric brought her to see the child. The old woman's face had gone pale as winter frost, and her hands trembled as she reached toward the mark with reverent care. "The blood of the Aesir flows through her veins. She is the last heir of the divine bloodline, the child the prophecies spoke of in the time before time." The revelations struck the assembled villagers like lightning, illuminating a landscape they had thought they knew, but had never truly seen. Freya was not merely a missing child. Returned home, she was living proof that the age of gods had not ended with Ragnarok, that divine heritage could emerge in the most unlikely places to fulfill purposes that mortals could barely comprehend. But Astrid's examination revealed an even more disturbing truth. The child had not been rescued from her captors. She had been hidden by them, protected and transformed according to plans that had been set in motion long before her birth. The hunger had not sought to devour her but to claim her, to corrupt the divine spark within her blood and turn it toward purposes that would unmake the very foundations of the world. They tried to change her. Astrid explained to the crowd that had gathered in Sigrid's house, her voice heavy with the weight of revelations that no parent should have to hear. To twist the divine heritage within her toward their own ends. She escaped before the process could be completed, but the transformation has begun. Already she sees things that mortal eyes should not perceive, hears voices that speak in languages older than human speech. Freya herself seemed unaware of the gravity of her situation, playing with an innocence that was both heartbreaking and terrifying. She spoke casually of the beautiful ladies who had shown her wonders beyond imagining, of crystalline palaces where time moved differently and music played that could heal any wound or grant any wish. Her words painted pictures of realm that existed alongside the mortal world, but followed entirely different rules, where the line between dream and reality became meaningless. "They said I was special," the child explained, with the matter-of-fact acceptance that marked the very young. "They said my blood sings with power that could help them fix what was broken when the old gods fell. They wanted to teach me songs that could reshape the world, but I missed my mother and wanted to come home." The true scope of the threat they faced became clear as Astrid translated the child's innocent words into their terrible implications. The hunger had not simply awakened to reclaim the world. Through brute force it had discovered the existence of Aesir bloodline and sought to pervert that divine heritage for its own purposes. If they had succeeded in fully corrupting Freya, her power could have been used to tear down every barrier that separated the natural world from the realm of ancient horrors. "She is the key," Astrid said simply, her blue eyes meeting Sigrid's with the gravity of absolute truth. "The bloodline that the enemy seeks to claim, the power that could either save this world or damn it utterly. They will come for her again. And next time, they will not be content with half measures or gentle persuasion." The child's return had not marked the end of their ordeal, but the beginning of something far more dangerous. Freya was now a beacon that would draw every servant of the hunger from across the northern wastes, a prize worth any sacrifice to claim or destroy. The village that had hoped for simple resolution found itself at the center of a conflict that would determine the fate of far more than their small community. Sigrid's family pendant, the silver Thor's hammer that had been passed down through generations, began to resonate with the child's presence. The metal grew warm against her skin whenever Freya drew near, and the ancient prayers carved into its surface seemed to glow with renewed power. Here was confirmation that the old faith still held meaning, that the gods had not abandoned the world entirely, but had left behind seeds of hope in the most unexpected places. "The bloodline was hidden for good reason," Astrid continued, her voice carrying the weight of history itself. "Scattered and diluted through mortal families, disguised so completely that even those who carried it remained unaware of their heritage. But divine power calls to divine power, and now that Freya has been awakened to her true nature, there can be no hiding from what she represents." The implications rippled through the gathered villagers like stones cast into still water. Their simple weaver had given birth to the last heir of the gods themselves, and their quiet village had become the focal point of a war between forces that had shaped the world since its creation. The comfortable certainties of their previous existence had been swept away as completely as snow before a spring flood. Eric felt the weight of his own destiny settling around him like a mantle he had never sought but could no longer refuse. If Freya carried the blood of the Aesir, then his role as her protector took on dimensions that stretched beyond the boundaries of a single lifetime. The training that Astrid had begun would need to accelerate, for the enemy would not wait for him to grow into his power at a natural pace. "How long do we have?" Bjorn asked, his voice carrying the practical concern of a leader who must plan for battles he barely understood. The weight of responsibility for his people's lives pressed down on him like the weight of winter itself, and he found himself longing for the simple days when the greatest threat had been harsh weather or failed harvests. Astrid's expression grew distant as she consulted knowledge that stretched back across centuries of vigilance. "The winter solstice approaches," she said finally. 3 nights when the barriers between worlds grow thin, when the old powers can manifest with greater strength than at any other time of year. They will come then, in force, seeking to claim what they believe belongs to them by right of ancient law. The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, acrid with the promise of trials yet to come. The comfortable world of ordinary concerns had been shattered beyond repair, replaced by a reality where gods and monsters walked among mortals, and the fate of everything they held dear hung in the balance of a single child's divine heritage. Time was running out, and the choices made in the next few days would determine whether Ravenshollow stood as humanity's bulwark against ancient darkness, or fell as another forgotten ruin in the wilderness. Its people scattered like leaves before the wind of powers too terrible to comprehend. The stones had stood in their sacred circle since before the first Norse longships touched these shores, weathered monuments to a time when the boundary between mortal and divine was thin as morning mist. Arranged in patterns that hurt the mind to contemplate fully, they formed what the old songs called a binding circle, a place where the fundamental forces that shaped reality could be contained, redirected, or in desperate circumstances, permanently severed from the world of mortal experience. Astrid stood at the circle's center as the winter solstice approached, her weathered hands moving with practiced precision as she renewed wards that had protected this valley for 23 years. Each stone bore runes carved deep into granite and basalt, their surfaces blackened by age but still pulsing with the accumulated power of generations who had stood watch over the ancient boundaries. The very air around the circle thrummed with potential, like the moment before lightning strikes when every hair stands on end and the world holds its breath. The village had transformed in the 3 days since Freya's return, unified by the terrible knowledge of what they faced and driven by the desperate determination of those who understand that failure means not merely death, but something far worse. The extinction of everything that made their world recognizable. Houses that had stood empty during the harvesting season were opened to accommodate refugees from the outlying farms, while every able-bodied adult worked to prepare defenses against an enemy that conventional weapons could not touch. Sigrid moved through the preparations with the focused intensity of a mother protecting her young, her silver pendant catching the weak winter light as she coordinated the evacuation of the most vulnerable. The Thor's hammer seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour, its metal warming against her skin whenever Freya drew near, as if the ancient faith it represented was awakening to meet the challenge of forces older than the gods themselves. The child at the center of it all remained remarkably calm, though those who looked closely could see the changes that continued to manifest in her divine heritage. Her eyes now held flecks of gold that seemed to move like living things, and her voice carried harmonics that made listeners lean closer despite themselves. When she spoke of the beautiful ladies who had tried to teach her their songs, her words painted pictures of realms where crystalline spires reached toward impossible skies, and music could reshape the very fabric of reality. "She grows stronger by the hour," Helga observed, her healer's instincts troubled by transformations that followed no natural pattern. The divine blood awakens within her, but without proper guidance, such power could consume her from within. We are asking a child to bear burdens that would challenge heroes of legend. Eric found himself caught between wonder and terror as he watched his role as protector take shape around him like armor forged by invisible smiths. The training that Astrid had begun proceeded with desperate urgency, each lesson compressed into hours that should have required months to properly absorb. Ancient knowledge flowed into his mind like water filling an empty vessel, but he wondered if there would be time to master even the basics before the final confrontation arrived. The wolves sensed the approaching storm with animal instincts that transcended mortal understanding. They moved through the village with unusual restlessness, their amber eyes scanning the forest for threats that human perception could not detect. The pack leader, whose runic collar had begun to glow with increasing intensity, never strayed far from Astrid's side, as if he understood that their centuries-long partnership was approaching its ultimate test. Bjorn wrestled with decisions that would have challenged the wisest rulers of legend, forced to balance traditional leadership against the counsel of those who possessed knowledge he barely comprehended. The weight of responsibility for 200 souls pressed down on him like the weight of winter itself, and he found himself praying to gods he had taken for granted, seeking wisdom for choices that would echo through generations yet unborn. The traditional barriers will not hold against what comes, Astrid explained to the council of village elders as they met in the great hall for what might be the final time. Her voice carried the certainty of someone who had seen such moments before, who understood the terrible arithmetic of supernatural warfare. Steel and wood, courage and determination, these have their place, but the enemy we face exists partially outside the natural order. Only power that draws from the same sources can hope to stand against it. The preparations required sacrifices that no one should have been asked to make. Families said farewells that might be permanent, while those too young or frail to contribute to the defense were hidden in root cellars and storage chambers that had been warded with symbols older than Christianity. The village's children, normally the center of community life, were gathered in the safest locations while their parents prepared to stand against nightmares given flesh and malevolent purpose. As the sun reached its lowest point in the sky, marking the beginning of the longest night, supernatural phenomena began to manifest throughout the valley. Aurora-like lights danced across the sky in colors that had no names, while the very air grew thick with possibilities that belonged to older times when gods walked among mortals. The temperature dropped beyond what even the harsh northern winter could explain, and ice began to form in patterns that spoke of intelligence behind their creation. The enemy's approach announced itself through changes that bypassed rational observation and spoke directly to the primitive parts of the human mind, where ancient fears still held dominion. Livestock fell silent with terror, while the village dogs cowered beneath their owners' tables, with the absolute stillness of creatures that understand they face predators beyond their ability to comprehend or resist. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if the very atmosphere awaited the outcome of forces that would reshape the fundamental nature of reality itself. Astrid's cottage had become a fortress of accumulated wisdom and desperate preparation, its walls lined with weapons that had never been meant for mortal hands and books whose pages contained knowledge that could drive unprepared minds to madness. The ancient staff that had served her for decades now thrummed with power that made the air around it visible as waves of distortion, while artifacts gathered from across the centuries of guardianship awaited their moment of ultimate purpose. "This is what I have spent my life preparing for," she told Eric as they made final adjustments to the ritual circle, her blue eyes reflecting depths of memory that stretched back across decades of vigilance. Not glory or recognition or even simple victory, but the chance to stand watch one final time over people who deserve to live without fear of things that lurk beyond the edges of their understanding. The young man felt the weight of succession settling around him like a mantle, woven from starlight and obligation, heavy with the knowledge that win or lose, nothing would ever be the same. The comfortable certainties of his previous existence had been swept away as completely as snow before a spring flood, replaced by responsibilities that would define the rest of his days, regardless of how few or many those might prove to be. Freya remained at the center of it all, the divine spark within her blood growing brighter as the solstice approached its deepest moment. The birthmark on her neck now glowed with steady phosphorescence, while her innocent words carried implications that spoke of power beyond mortal comprehension. She had become living proof that the age of gods had not ended with Ragnarok, but had instead transformed into something more subtle and far more dangerous. "They're coming," the child said suddenly, her voice carrying across the village despite its whispered volume. "The beautiful ladies and their singing wolves. They say it's time for me to learn the real songs, the ones that can make the broken world whole again." The words fell into the gathered silence like stones cast into still water, creating ripples of understanding that spread through every soul who heard them. In the distance, something that was not quite music began to echo from the ancient stones, where warnings had been carved in scripts older than human memory. The final phase of a game that had been played across centuries was about to begin, and the stakes had never been higher. The supernatural storm that had been building since Freya's return reached its crescendo as the sun touched the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson that spoke of battles fought between forces too vast for mortal comprehension. Aurora-like phenomena danced across the heavens in patterns that followed no natural law, while the very foundations of reality seemed to tremble in anticipation of what was to come. Time was running out for them all, and the choices made in the next few hours would determine whether Ravenshollow stood as humanity's bulwark against ancient darkness, or fell as another forgotten ruin in the wilderness, its people scattered like autumn leaves before winds that blew from realms where nightmare was, the only reality that mattered. The hunger manifested at the stroke of midnight, when the winter solstice reached its deepest point, and the barriers between worlds grew thin as spider silk. It did not arrive, as the villagers had expected, no howling pack of supernatural wolves or army of shambling corpses, but as something far more terrible in its alien majesty. The very air began to twist and fold upon itself, creating spaces that existed partially outside normal geometry, while reality itself seemed to recoil from the presence of something that should never have been permitted to exist. From these impossible spaces emerged the true enemy, and those who witnessed its manifestation understood why their ancestors had carved warnings in stone and bound their most terrible knowledge in books meant never to be opened. The hunger wore the shape of a woman, but her beauty was the kind that drove mortals to madness, too perfect, too symmetrical, touched with harmonics that spoke of realms where different laws governed existence. Her hair flowed like liquid starlight, and her eyes held depths that contained the accumulated malevolence of centuries spent in exile from the mortal realm. Behind her came her servants, the corrupted wolves that had terrorized the hunting party. But now they were revealed in their true nature as Einherjar, who had fallen to darkness, warriors who had died with honor, but been raised to serve powers that mocked everything they had once held sacred. Their forms shifted between wolf and man, between flesh and shadow, as if death had not entirely released its claim on their essential nature. Astrid stood at the center of the binding circle, her ancient staff blazing with power that made the very air visible as waves of distortion. The runes carved into the standing stones responded to her presence, glowing with accumulated force that had been building for generations. Around her, the four wolves took positions that spoke of old military discipline, their amber eyes reflecting not just the supernatural light, but memories of battles fought when the world was younger and the gods still walked among mortals. "So you are the one who has stood watch all these years," the hunger spoke, her voice carrying harmonics that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the primitive parts of the human soul. The guardian who thought she could delay the inevitable, protect the mortals from truths too vast for their comprehension. "You have done well, Astrid Eriksdottir, but your time is ending, and the child's true education must begin." The battle commenced not with the clash of weapons, but with a contest of wills that made the very foundations of reality tremble. Astrid drew upon decades of accumulated power, channeling force through the binding circle that had been designed to contain threats, exactly like this one. The ancient stones sang with harmonics that hurt to hear, their surfaces glowing white-hot as energies older than human civilization flowed through granite and basalt. But the hunger had not spent centuries in exile without learning patience and cunning. Her assault came not as brute force but as corruption, seeking to turn the very defenses of the village against itself. The wards that Astrid had maintained for 23 years began to shift and change, their protective nature slowly inverting as alien intelligence worked to subvert purposes that had seemed unshakable. The villagers felt it as a presence pressing against their minds, offering visions of worlds where suffering was unknown, and every desire could be fulfilled with a simple thought. The beautiful lies whispered of power beyond mortal understanding, of the chance to reshape reality according to human will, rather than accepting the limitations imposed by natural law. Several of the younger adults began to walk toward the circle, as if in a trance, their faces serene with the terrible peace of those who have surrendered their will to something greater than themselves. Eric found himself at the center of a maelstrom of forces he barely understood, the training Astrid had given him seeming pathetically inadequate against powers that had shaped the world since its creation. But the broken runestone he carried pulsed with warmth against his chest, and in its fragmentary warnings he found something resembling guidance. The ancient script spoke of binding not through force, but through willing sacrifice, of victory achieved, not through conquest, but through the courage to surrender everything in service of something greater. Freya stood at the edge of the circle, her divine heritage blazing like a beacon that drew every eye and made the very air around her shimmer with possibilities. The birthmark on her neck had begun to glow with steady phosphorescence, and her innocent voice carried harmonics that made listeners lean closer despite themselves. The hunger reached toward the child with something resembling maternal affection, offering wisdom and power beyond mortal comprehension. "Come to me, little star daughter," the creature crooned, her voice weaving promises that spoke of crystalline palaces where time moved differently and music played that could reshape the fundamental nature of existence. "Let me teach you the songs that your blood remembers, the melodies that can heal what was broken when the old gods fell." But Astrid's wolves understood what their mistress intended, and their centuries of loyalty would not be shaken by offers of power or threats of destruction. They moved with the coordinated precision of warriors who had fought together across impossible years, their forms beginning to shift and change as the true nature of their binding to the mortal realm became clear. These were not merely large wolves, but Einherjar chosen, slain, who had earned the right to serve in death as they had in life. The Alpha, whose collar bore runes that predated the Norse gods themselves, began to glow with inner fire. As Fenrir's fang, a massive wolf tooth that had been embedded in his collar, responded to the presence of powers that threatened everything he had sworn to protect. The artifact pulsed with primal force that spoke of the earliest days of the world, when the line between creation and destruction was thin as morning mist. The first phase of the binding ritual began as Astrid spoke words in a language that had been old when the world was young, her voice joining with those of her wolves in harmonies that made the standing stones ring like bells. The hunger recoiled slightly, her perfect features marred by the first expression of uncertainty she had shown since her manifestation. The battle for Ravenshallow's soul had begun in earnest, and the outcome remained balanced on a knife's edge between salvation and damnation. The moment of ultimate sacrifice arrived, like the breaking of a dam that had held back forces too vast for mortal comprehension. Astrid felt her mortal frame beginning to fail under the strain of channeling power that belonged to the earliest days of creation, when gods and monsters walked the earth as equals and the fate of worlds hung in the balance of individual choices. Her weathered hands, which had gripped weapons in service of causes greater than herself, now trembled as she poured the accumulated strength of 73 years into the binding ritual that would either save Ravenshallow or destroy it utterly. The rune that appeared on her forehead blazed with light that hurt to look upon directly, the last rune, a symbol that had never been meant for mortal flesh, but which sometimes manifested when the boundary between life and death became negotiable. It marked her transformation from guardian to something more fundamental, a living conduit between the mortal realm and the divine forces that still watched over the world from their exile beyond the edges of perception. "No," the hunger shrieked, her perfect features contorting with rage as she recognized what was taking place before her. "You cannot deny us what is ours by right of ancient law. The child's blood sings with power that predates your petty gods, and she will serve our purposes, whether you will it or not." But Freya herself stepped forward, her small hand reaching out to touch Astrid's trembling fingers with a gesture that carried the weight of divine authority. The birthmark on her neck pulsed with steady rhythm, and when she spoke, her child's voice carried harmonics that belonged to the eldest daughters of the Aesir themselves. "I choose," she said simply, her words falling into the chaos of supernatural combat like stones cast into stormy waters. "The beautiful ladies offered me wonders, but they wanted me to forget who I am, where I come from, why love matters more than power. I choose to remember." The declaration sent shockwaves through the assembled forces of corruption, for they had planned for resistance, but not for the willing rejection of everything they offered. The divine heritage that they sought to claim and corrupt blazed brighter in response to the child's choice, its light beginning to stabilize around principles that no amount of alien wisdom could shake. Eric felt the mantle of guardianship settling around his shoulders like armor forged from starlight and obligation. heavy with the knowledge that he was accepting responsibility for something far greater than his own life, or even the survival of his community. The broken runestone in his hands grew warm, its fragmentary warning suddenly complete as the missing pieces manifested in letters of living fire. The wolves made their final transformation, their forms shifting from flesh to something more fundamental, as their true nature, as Ein-Hajar, was revealed to all who witnessed it. No longer bound by the limitations of mortal flesh, they became what they had always been in spirit, warriors of light, standing against darkness, that sought to unmake the very concept of hope. Sigrid watched her daughter's apotheosis with the complex mixture of pride and loss that marks all parents who see their children grow beyond their ability to protect or guide them. The silver pendant at her throat blazed with reflected glory, its ancient prayers finding new relevance as Thor's protection extended through her to encompass the divine child who had chosen love over power. The binding reached its crescendo as Astrid spoke the final words of an incantation that had been old when the world was young, her voice joining with those of her transformed wolves in harmonies that made reality itself ring like a struck bell. The hunger fought against the forces that sought to contain it, its servants throwing themselves against barriers that grew stronger with each passing moment. But the true victory came not through conquest, but through transformation. The evil that had sought to corrupt Freya's divine heritage found itself unable to touch something that had been freely chosen and willingly protected. The child's power, instead of being claimed by alien purposes, became the cornerstone of a new form of guardianship that would protect not just Ravenshollow, but all the scattered communities where mortals sought to build lives worth living. The last rune on Astrid's forehead pulsed one final time before fading into something gentler but no less permanent. The mark of someone who had completed the work she was born to do and found peace in the knowledge that others would carry on where she could no longer go. Her mortal flesh released its hold on power too vast for human vessels, but her spirit remained, transformed into something that could watch over the village she had protected for so long. Eric felt the full weight of succession as the ancient knowledge and accumulated wisdom of generations settled into his consciousness, like seeds finding fertile ground. He was no longer simply a blacksmith's apprentice, but the guardian of something precious beyond measure, the right of ordinary people to live without fear of forces they could never understand or resist. The hunger and its servants found themselves bound by choices they had never expected, trapped by the very corruption they had sought to spread. In seeking to claim divine power through deception and force, they had instead created the conditions for their own eternal containment. As the supernatural storm began to dissipate and the normal rhythms of winter night reasserted themselves, Ravenshollow stood transformed but intact. The ancient cycle of protection continued, but now it rested in younger hands, guided by wisdom that had been earned through sacrifice and tempered by love that chose service over dominion. The battle was won, but the war for the soul of the world would continue as long as mortals needed champions willing to stand watch over the things that mattered most. Spring came early, to Ravenshollow that year, as if the earth itself sought to wash away the memory of the longest night with sunshine and the promise of new growth. The snow that had seemed eternal during the dark days of winter began to melt with unusual haste, revealing meadows where wildflowers bloomed weeks ahead of their normal season. The very air carried a different quality, cleaner, somehow, as if supernatural forces had scrubbed it free of influences that had pressed close for too many years. Eric Ragnarsson walked the morning circuit that had once been Astrid's responsibility, but his procession looked different from what the villagers had grown accustomed to over the past 23 years. Instead of 4 massive grey wolves, 3 young cubs padded alongside him, their amber eyes already showing signs of the intelligence that marked their supernatural heritage, but their movements carrying the playful energy of creatures who had never known the weight of ancient sorrows. The simple woolen cloak he wore bore no runes or mystical markings, nothing that would set him apart from any other young man taking a morning walk through his village. But those who looked closely could see the way shadows bent toward him, the manner in which wildlife showed him the respectful distance that marked the presence of power held in careful check. He carried himself with the measured dignity of someone who understood that true authority came not from display, but from the quiet acceptance of responsibility for things greater than himself. The cottage at the forest's edge had been transformed from a fortress of accumulated mysteries into something that felt more like a home. Eric had kept many of Astrid's books and artifacts, understanding that knowledge was too precious to discard. But he had also opened the shutters that had remained closed for decades and planted a garden where ordinary vegetables grew alongside the more exotic herbs that his guardianship required. Freya continued to live with her mother in the village proper, but her presence had become a source of wonder rather than fear. The birthmark on her neck had faded to little more than a faint outline, visible only to those who knew where to look, while her divine heritage manifested in smaller, more manageable ways. She could heal minor wounds with a touch. Her laughter could chase away the shadows that sometimes gathered in dark corners, and her dreams occasionally carried glimpses of wisdom that helped the village navigate challenges, both ordinary and supernatural. Sigrid had aged gracefully into her role as mother to a child touched by divine purpose, finding in her daughter's transformation not loss, but a deeper understanding of the forces that shaped the world. The silver pendant still hung at her throat, but now it felt warm, with something more than mere faith. It carried the living presence of protection that had been earned through trial and sacrifice. The village itself had grown more prosperous than anyone could remember, as if their success in protecting something truly precious had earned them blessings that extended far beyond mere survival. Trade routes that had bypassed Ravenshollow for generations began to include them as a regular stop, bringing news and goods from distant lands. Crops grew more abundant, livestock remained healthier, and the harsh northern winters seemed less cruel than they had in living memory. But perhaps the most significant change was in the people themselves. The comfortable certainties that had once marked their daily lives had been replaced by something more complex and far more valuable. The knowledge that they lived in a world where wonders were possible, where ordinary people could make choices that echoed across generations, where love and sacrifice could triumph over forces that seemed insurmountable. Eric's daily routine included stops at the graves that had been added to the village cemetery since the night of the binding. Magnus rested beneath a stone carved with symbols that honored both his skill as a smith and his courage in facing threats beyond mortal understanding. Astrid's marker stood at the forest's edge, where wildflowers bloomed in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be entirely natural, and where visitors sometimes reported seeing a figure in grey watching over the village during particularly quiet moments. The binding circle remained, but its character had changed from a place of desperate defense to something more resembling a shrine. The standing stones no longer hummed with barely contained power, but radiated the gentle warmth of forces held in perfect balance. Children played among them without fear, while their parents brought offerings of flowers and simple foods to honor the sacrifice that had preserved their peaceful way of life. As Eric completed his morning circuit and returned to the cottage where his new responsibilities awaited, he paused to look back at the village that had become his charge. Smoke rose from chimneys in the familiar pattern of daily life beginning, while the sounds of ordinary activity, blacksmiths' hammers, weavers' looms, children's laughter provided the soundtrack to a world that had been preserved against forces that would have reduced it to silence and ash. The cloak he wore settled around his shoulders with the comfortable weight of accepted purpose, neither heavy nor light, but simply right for the man he had become. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, as all days did, but he faced them with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that the most important battles were often fought not with sword and spear, but with the simple determination to protect what mattered most. In her weaver's workshop, Sigrid worked at her loom with hands that had grown sure through years of practice, creating patterns that seemed to capture something of the village's renewed vitality in cloth that would warm bodies and lift spirits throughout the close. Coming winter, her daughter played nearby, building castles from scraps of wool and singing songs that carried harmonics of older melodies, divine heritage, channeled into the innocent creativity that marked childhood at its best. The morning sun climbed higher over Ravenshollow, illuminating a community that had faced its greatest trial and emerged not merely intact, but transformed into something stronger and more beautiful than it had ever been before. The ancient cycle of protection continued, as it always had, but now it rested in hands that understood both the weight of responsibility and the joy that came from serving something greater than oneself. Whatever challenges might arise from forest or mountain, whatever threats might emerge from the wild places where ancient things still stirred, they would find Ravenshollow ready protected, not by walls or weapons, but by the unbreakable bonds of community and the willing sacrifice of those who understood that some things were worth any price to preserve.